Hey there everyone, Mr. Lewis here, ready to go through section 3.4 of Unit 3 in AP Human Geography today, Types of Diffusion. So let's do it. Up to this point, we've been talking mostly about the aspects and elements of folk and pop culture, but today we're talking about how that culture spreads. And it spreads in one of two main types of what we call diffusion. This is a term that you've learned before. Diffusion is simply the spread of people, ideas, and objects, or in other words, culture, right? And so there's two main types. One is relocation diffusion, which is simply migration and the physical movement of people, whereas expansion diffusion takes place as something spreads in an additive process. So there are three different types of expansion diffusion. One is what we call hierarchical diffusion, one is what we call contagious, and the other is stimulus. And so let's take a look at these three different types of expansion diffusion. Hierarchical diffusion is within a hierarchy, as the name would suggest. And it's when we have this node of power or authority, so some kind of leadership figure at the top of a hierarchy. And that hierarchy could be a legal structure, it could be a bunch of fans, it could be a lot of different things. So if a legal leader passes a law, right, or a group of leaders passes a law, that law is something that we are all supposed to do. And so it's a legal way of changing behavior and diffusing, but it is an example of hierarchical diffusion. Contagious diffusion, on the other hand, is when something catches on so quickly, like a wildfire, that you just can't stop it. And some examples are actual things that are contagious, like the flu. For example, the flu epidemic of 1918 that you've probably been hearing a lot about lately. But it could also be things like an app, like TikTok, that catches on and people are downloading that app so quickly, and the trend is really hard to stop, right? Whereas with stimulus diffusion, it's something that's expanding very quickly. It's very similar to contagious, except the difference with stimulus diffusion is that it expands one underlying principle while leaving some specific characteristics behind. So, an example of this would be like the Macintosh mouse. So, the Macintosh mouse comes out, it's the first mouse that was released, and other computers start looking at that thing and they're like, you know what? We can make that, but we're going to do it in a different way. So today you have all these different types of mouses around, some of which are built right into the computer, right? But it all comes down to really just being able to point and click on your screen, as we do most days of our lives now. So another example of stimulus diffusion is religion, right? As you look at any religion, let's take Christianity for example, there are lots of different factions or denominations of Christianity. So even though there are some underlying principles in there that they all believe, they practice that religion in different ways. That's stimulus diffusion. So within folk culture, we tend to see relocation diffusion occurring. Things are passed along through migration, right? Through the physical movement of people, and it tends to take a long time and moves very slowly on a small scale because that folk culture is so isolated and people don't tend to leave those folk cultures too often. So unless somebody comes to them or unless they go outside of that folk culture, those customs might not be passed along so quickly, right? Whereas in popular culture, it's really, really easy to pass things along. Diffusion, typically expansion diffusion, happens rapidly. So popular culture becomes so popular because it expands rather quickly. We're going to talk more about today's world of diffusion and how it relates to, say, smartphones or social media and communication systems and technology in general that we have today, and give you some contemporary examples of diffusion in the next section. We're going to do that in 3.5. Today we're focusing more on some historical examples. So one example is imperialism, colonization. Colonization and the period of exploration throughout the 1400s and 1500s and 16, 1700s, led to a lot of diffusion that really created the world that we have here today in the Americas and other parts of the world. So let's take a look. British colonization led to all kinds of expansions of material culture, British material culture, and the culture of the places that they colonized, right? So the British were massive. The British Empire, you got to understand, controlled about a fifth of the world's landmass at one point. So with them, as they were colonizing these areas, they brought a lot of their customs along. So you can see, like in Australia, the sports in Australia are very much a reflection of British colonization there. Rugby, cricket, those kind of games. Clothing in Canada, you look at the uniform worn by a Canadian Mountie cop here, and it's very similar to the British Royal Guard, right? The hats are a little different, but very similar clothing styles, and you can see that in like their military garb and things like that as well. And then food and drink. Interesting story here. So when the British first colonized India, they found this local tea that was being made, and they expanded it into this massive economic opportunity that India actually today still uses. They're still one of the global leaders in tea exports as well as spice exports. And when you look back at English culture today, you can see the popularity of the spices and the tea that were brought back from India. So kind of some cross diffusion happening there, right? You can also see the examples, and they are plentiful, of Spanish cultural diffusion in the Americas. So the Spanish Empire started in Central and South America, but made its way up into North America. And as you know, today we have a very rich history in the United States of Spanish culture, especially as you move south, getting closer to Mexico and Central America and Latin America. So not only do we see Spanish cuisine everywhere, we also hear the Spanish language spoken widely throughout the United States and predominantly in Central America and South America, with the exception of Brazil, who speaks Portuguese mostly because the Portuguese Empire colonized Brazil. So you can start to see some of these connections. We also have these Spanish cultural holidays that are very much celebrated in the United States, such as the Day of the Dead, which just happened this past weekend. And then finally, the French Empire. You can see, and the French had a vast empire all the way out to Vietnam in Asia, down to Africa. This is Algeria on your left and Vietnam on your right. And as you can see, this is very similar architecture, and it's in the style of French architecture. So these arched windows with these really pretty balconies and the intricate design in those balconies, very much French culture, right? And there are a lot of buildings today that are even, new buildings being constructed that are influenced by this architecture that was left over when Vietnam left these areas, when these areas got their independence. So architecture is another example of material culture being passed around the world. So then we get into religion. Religion has been one of the dominant factors in culture diffusing throughout the world. And you got to remember, there is just the aspect of religious diffusion and religion as a culture spreading, but also with that religion, if people are migrating to pass their religion along, they're going to pick up other types of behaviors and customs and cuisines, right? And clothing, and diffusion is going to happen on a massive scale. So religion has been one of the dominant factors in for diffusion occurring over the past really couple thousand years, right? Throughout modern history, especially. So you can see that here we've got three different nodes of hearths, I should say, of these religions. And Christianity's in purple here. Christianity started in Israel, which is all the way over here in Western Asia, right along the Mediterranean Sea. Islam in orange, which began in Saudi Arabia in a place called Mecca and a place called Medina along the coast here, right, of Saudi Arabia. And then finally, the last hearth here in green is Buddhism. And Buddhism's hearth, its origins, are found in northeast India around Nepal. So Nepal is the country right here between India and China. And as you can see, Buddhism spread throughout India and throughout China and throughout the rest of Asia and particularly Eastern Asia here, right? So these arrows, the purple arrows for Christianity, the orange arrows for Islam, and the green arrows for Buddhism are all showing you the migration of people who were going out attempting to proselytize others or convert people to their faith. And as they did this, they were diffusing not just religion, but all aspects of their culture, right? And we see tons and tons of new connect points being made between people around the world. And they start passing along language and religion and customs and food and drink and behaviors and clothing. And we are creating, we're witnessing the creation of the very diverse world that we have today. So you can see around the world today, based on the country's color inside its borders, which is a choropleth map, if you recall, we're seeing the predominance of different religions around the world. So in purple, those countries would be predominantly Christian. And again, it doesn't mean 100%, right? Just the majority of people. And in green, we see countries that are mostly Muslim. And in orange, we see countries that are mostly Hindu, with India being the largest one by far. And you can see that it's the countries surrounding India that are also predominantly Hindu. And then in red, Buddhist. China's an interesting one. They have this light purple color, almost kind of pinkish color, which if you look at our key here, says non-religious. That is a result of the communist government in China. So it's very much a result of hierarchical diffusion, right? And that's a good example of how hierarchical diffusion can take place as a result of, in this case, the government, which is very much a node of authority. Finally, just for your own interest, I put this last map on here that gives you a more detailed breakdown of religion around the world. So the two predominant religions in the world are Christianity and Islam, but there are different types, right? So in Islam, you can see here in the Middle East and out into North Africa where it diffused to, there are dark blue areas and light blue areas. Light blue areas represent Sunni Muslims and dark blue would be Shiite Muslims. And that's what we call denominations, right? There are different factions or denominations within different religions. Within Christianity, there are Roman Catholics, as represented by the color yellow here. There are Protestants, orange. There are Mormons, which are in blue here, right? And you can see that we've got this little pocket of blue out west in the United States. This is mostly Utah. Utah is very well known for being predominantly Mormon. But the point is, we have different denominations within these larger religions. So as you look around the world, it's very different looking at this map compared to this one. This makes it look like there's a very uniform landscape, right? And there's a lot of homogenization and all these purple countries must be exactly the same. Not true at all. And as you can see on this map, there are many different types of not just Christianity, but religions of every kind around the world and in different pockets around the world. One of the more interesting things, I think, is if you look at, and this is the last thing I'll leave you with, if you look at this light purple color, indigenous religions. These are folk religions, right? These are localized religions that have been developed and protected for likely thousands and thousands of years in these isolated folk cultures. So kind of interesting to see where some of those are located. All right, that's it for today, everyone. We'll cover section 3.5 next week and wrap up unit 3. Have a great weekend. I'll see you then.